For today, we are going to be going over Genesis chapter 33, verses 1 through 17. And I entitled this lesson, Burying the Hatchet. We have here a reconciliation of these two warring brothers, Jacob and Esau, that we've been reading about for probably, a month and a half now. And now we get some resolution, some restitution, and a new chapter in the saga of Jacob and his journeying in his journey of faith. So we will begin at the very first verse. Now Jacob looked up and saw Esau coming, and 400 men with him. So he divided the children among Leah and Rachel and the two maids. He put the maids with their children in front, then Leah with her children, and Rachel and Joseph last of all. So picking up where we left off at the end of chapter 31 and into 32, before Jacob's encounter where he wrestled with God at Peniel. That was a sort of an interlude, and now Jacob is approaching his brother, and Esau is coming packing, as it was previously mentioned in an earlier chapter, with 400 men in tow. Handel writes this: Jacob's defensive strategy on seeing Esau with 400 men is to divide the women and children into three groups, from least to most valuable. His preference for Rachel and Joseph, placing them last of all, recalls the reason for his wives' rivalry in chapters 29 and 30, and anticipates conflict between Joseph and his brothers. We'll come back to this point in a little bit. It's a detail that could pass us by quite quickly, but we see here again, even after all of the hubbub and all of the trouble, Jacob continuing to prefer his second wife over his primary wife, Leah, and giving Rachel the place of preference, the place of safety as they're approaching Esau. Verse 3, he himself, he being Jacob, went on ahead of them, bowing himself to the ground 7 times until he came near his brother. Jacob's courage is evidenced by his going out ahead of his family. We are to envision him limping whilst prostrating himself before his brother. Perhaps we are to think that he has found his courage because he has just looked on the face of God and lived. So he's limping though he may be, he is approaching his brother, not in fear, but with more confidence. Now he can look on the face of his brother without fear, for he knows that God will see him through. Fritham writes, Jacob himself goes ahead of them, bowing 7 times like a vassal before his Lord, perhaps an acceptance of wrongdoing. In fact, he refers to Esau as his Lord 5 times in the exchange that follows. Here is a humbled Jacob throwing himself to the mercy of the brother he has sorely wronged. So, verse 4. But Esau ran to meet him and embraced him, and fell on his neck and kissed him, and they wept. When Esau looked up and saw the woman and children, he said, who are these with you? Jacob said, the children whom God has graciously given your servant. Then the maids drew near, they and their children, and bowed down. Leah likewise and her children drew near and bowed down. And finally, Joseph and Rachel drew near, and they bowed down. Quoting Fritham, Jacob's solitary limping toward Esau and bowing to the ground constitutes clearly the vulnerable move that makes possible what happens next. But Esau, too, takes an important initiative. He runs to meet Jacob, embraces him, throws his arms around him, kisses him, and weeps, supposed to read weeps with him. The impressive list of welcoming activities is unparalleled elsewhere in Genesis. Handel writes, Esau's running to meet Jacob is possibly a feared violent attack. So if you put yourself in Jacob's position, approaching alone and ahead of his family, and then he sees his brother who, 2 decades past, more than 20 years ago, he had sorely wronged, running at him. Jacob may not necessarily know what is going on in Esau's mind, but instead of an attack, there is a traditional joyous greeting of kin. Instead of an attack, the brothers are reconciled. Esau has been wronged and has the power to exact justice. After all, he's coming with 400 men in tow. However, he chooses reconciliation rather than revenge. Verse 8, Esau said, "What do you mean by all this company that I've met?" Jacob answered, "To find favor with my lord." But Esau said, "I have enough, my brother. Keep what you have for yourself." Jacob said, "No, please. If I find favor with you, then accept my present from my hand. For truly to see your face is like seeing the face of God, since you have received me with such favor. Please accept my gift that is brought to you, because God has dealt graciously with me and because I have everything I want." So he urged him, and he took it. That phrase, "to find favor with," is Jacob's explaining to Esau why he has brought all of these gifts ahead of him to give to Esau. That phrase, "to find favor with," can be rendered "to find kindness with." And of this word, Green writes, here is translated a Hebrew word that means graciousness beyond what is deserved or required. And so Jacob is really laying it on. And perhaps before this was because he was fearful for his life. But now that he's seen the face of God and has lived, he's no longer afraid. And it does seem to be a generous act of blessing that Jacob feels compelled to give to Esau, not because he has to, but because he wants to. Handel writes, Jacob hopes to find favor with Esau, apparently by offering all his possessions as a gift. But Esau shows that he harbors no ill will, replying that he has enough. In this exchange, Esau shows virtue and eloquence and apparently has prospered in spite of the loss of his blessing. So maybe this is one of the reasons why Esau has cooled his temper, because he has found over the years that he has still been blessed and has still found himself to have, well, command over 400 men, as I keep mentioning, but then also probably lands and wives. We know he has wives and children and livestock and all of the things that Jacob has come to present him with. You may have noticed in verse 10 that it reads, to see your face, meaning Esau's face, is like seeing the face of God. This is high praise and also ironic, since Jacob has just seen God face to face the night before. And in both meetings, to Jacob's relief, his life was preserved. Now, presenting gifts, as we read in verse 11, is a common ritual in biblical society. The Hebrew term behind present can also mean blessing. The same term was used in Genesis chapter 27 to refer to the blessing that Jacob stole from Esau. Jacob uses the word here to say that he is giving back what he wrongfully took, or at least is making amends. So apparently, restitution goes hand in hand with reconciliation. It's as if that Jacob is showing himself to be sorry for stealing the blessing in the first place and insists on giving it back in kind, which is what he does. He eventually wears Esau down and he receives the gifts. But moving on, verse 12. Then Esau said, let us journey on our way, and I will go alongside you. But Jacob said to him, my Lord knows that the children are frail, and that the flocks and herds which are nursing are a care to me. And if they are overdriven for one day, all the flocks will die. Let my Lord pass on ahead of his servant, and I will lead on slowly according to the pace of the cattle that are before me, and according to the pace of the children, until I come to my Lord in Seir. So Esau said, let me leave you with some of the people who are with me. But he said, why should my Lord be so kind to me? So Esau returned that day on his way to Seir. But Jacob journeyed to Succoth and built himself a house and made booths for his cattle. Therefore, the place is called Succoth. For brothers who have recently reconciled, they are sure reticent to depart as one family unit, or at least Jacob seems reticent to depart as one family unit. It seems that Esau is wanting to return home together along with Jacob. However, Jacob demurs and deflects, insisting on lingering behind and claiming that he will catch up with Esau later. And he gives a variety of excuses, but says the children are frail, they can't walk that fast. And if we walk that fast, keep up with you with all of our herds and cattle, they'll all die along the way. And when Esau says, well, I'll leave some of the people that I have here behind with you, Jacob kind of shuts down the conversation quickly. Says, why should my Lord be so kind to me? And that's the end of their conversation. And they go separate ways. However, Jacob does say that he will catch up with Esau later. a claim that Jacob fails to make good on. He doesn't actually catch up with Esau, but goes somewhere else. And there are reasons why we speculate this may be the case. We don't really know for sure why it is that Jacob tells Esau one thing and then does another, and why Jacob feels reticent to continue on with his brother. It seems like, based on what we had just read before, that it should be no problem to go forward. They had hugged, they wept together, they embraced, they kissed. It seems like all things are going good, but apparently Jacob isn't quite wanting to move in with Esau. And so there's possible motives, and I've listed 3 here that the commentators bring up. And each commentator seems to have a favorite theory. I really don't know which of these 3 I'm about to present are the most plausible. But one possible motive is continued mistrust. Handel writes, Jacob remains unsure of Esau's intentions and gives deceptive excuses not to travel to Seir with him. Instead, Jacob journeys towards Canaan and stays for a time at Succoth, east of the Jordan River, so called because he built booths, which is this word Succoth, literally just means booths. It's called that because he built booths there. Another possible motive, maybe Jacob felt he needed space to branch out. The reason Jacob gives in verses 13 through 14 remains somewhat obscure, but it may mean that Jacob's family needs some independence to develop properly. Now separated from the family in Haran, Jacob's family must establish its own identity, writes Fritham. So perhaps Jacob interprets his brother's invitation to travel on together as an overture to merge families. And maybe this is not something that Jacob is wanting to do. Then the last, I called it a motive, but it's really maybe more an indicator of what's going on in the minds of the scribes that wrote this story down and put it in its current form. But the reason why it may have been written the way that it was written, and why Jacob in the story doesn't go on with Esau, is to explain future national dynamics. And this for sure would have been the way that this story was first understood, to help explain why there was distance and space between the people of Edom Abraham as their progenitor. But then they had this reality that the Edomites lived in one place, and sometimes they had wars and fights with them. And so why is this? Well, the stories like this serve to explain these things. So here's a good moment to remind ourselves that these stories served as national origin stories meant to explain complex tribal/national conflicts centuries later. Jacob and Esau go their own ways. Their separation points to how their descendants were divided and lived in different homelands. Seir is the name for the land of Edomites southwest of the Dead Sea. Succoth is probably located at the mouth of the Jabbok River in the Jordan Valley on the traditional border of Israel. So it really serves well as a national origin story. To conclude, what to take away from today's story? Well, throughout Israel's history, this story would have been read through the lens of local tribal conflicts. As such, it would have encouraged the people of Israel to live peacefully with their neighbors, the Edomites in specific. The story promotes reconciliation rather than violence when conflicts arise. Because Jacob and Esau represent the Israelites and the Edomites, the text promotes peace between family members and nations. In both the Jacob and Joseph stories, the injured party, 1, has good reasons for revenge, 2, has the power to harm the wrongdoer, and 3, make sure that peace comes about instead. The story claims that no matter how severe the conflict or how deeply rooted in past history, reconciliation among brothers remains a possibility, even if that does not finally eventuate in a close relationship. Now, upon first blush, the saga between Jacob and Esau has a satisfactory conclusion, one that does not result in bloodshed. However, the seeds for further dissension are present both between Esau and Jacob's future descendants and even within Jacob's own household. How if Jacob had taken Esau up on his offer to journey forward together? This very well may have resulted in a very different kind of future for Israel. Also, going back to what we read in the first opening verses, we should note what Jacob's ordering of his family will signify. As Jacob paraded his family before Esau, he placed Rachel and Joseph at the place of most importance in preference over his primary wife, Leah, and her children. This would result in interfamilial conflict in the decades to come, resulting in Joseph's being sold into slavery by his brothers. Now, again, I'm sure my next impulse is to remind us that throughout the course of Joseph's life, we see God intervening on behalf of Joseph and for Joseph's benefit. And so God redeems and restores within that story again and again and again. And it does have, as we will find, a happy conclusion, and brothers in that story are reconciled. But in the time in between, let's face it, things got pretty bad for Joseph. And this is a direct result of this enmity that was baking in the family, that was simmering under the surface as Jacob continued to prefer one of his wives over the other, going against cultural customs, I might add, in the meantime. So one moral of the story may be reconciliation and restitution should be total when possible. Unresolved conflicts may eventually come back to bite us in the end. As we will see, they will. These are the sources that I consulted for today's lesson. And we're back. As I said, this lesson was fairly straightforward. I saw no reason to belabor the points. They're pretty obvious, and sometimes the most fun I have when we're doing Bible lessons is when there is something that is not a meaning that is not obvious to modern readers. But in this story, it's fairly straightforward. We have a moving scene between brothers. We have Jacob showing that he is sorry and is wanting to make restitution by giving back the blessing, as it were, that he had stolen from his brother Esau. Then we do just have those questions at the end as to why Jacob, trickster though he always is, one last time says one thing and then does another thing. And the last time that the brothers come back together in the stories in chapter 35, where they bury their father together. So there's evidence of some collaboration, and that the bad blood is behind them. But I'm left with the family dynamics that we've been talking about chapter by chapter that are still there, especially as it relates to within Jacob's household and how he's preferring one wife and her children, Rachel and Joseph, over the others will create more problems in the future. It just shows that you let sleeping dogs lie, they will bite you.
Because Esau's the Edomites, right?
Yeah, so by the time this story was put to paper and people would be reading it, they served as national origin stories. So explanations. Why are the Edomites over there? And why do we sometimes fight with them? Although there are large pockets of cooperation and times where the Edomites, though not the same nation as Israel, were also living amicably alongside Israel. So it's very much like the relationship between the two boys that we read about, often at war, and then also with prolonged periods of no contact to cooperative contact. And so the first hearers of this story would have understood it as an explanation for the world around them, why things were the way they were.
I got interested in the fact that he bowed down 7 times. And I thought, why not 6? Why not 3? I looked up 7 as the significance of the number in the Bible. And it said it was often used to represent the idea of completeness and perfection. And it went on to say that 7 is mentioned 735 times in the Bible, 54 in Revelation. And it gave some other instances, like they marched around Jericho for 7 days and then 7 times on the last day. And we were told to forgive 7 times, not 7, but 77 times. And you get to thinking about it. I mean, creation, 7 days, that's certainly a completion and perfection. And then even in our story of Jacob, we find him working 7 years for Rachel, and then 7 years. And you just find 7 so often. And I just found that interesting.
You hit it right on the head. It means completeness. And the way it functions in the context of this story today is, and as I read in one commentator said, there's no other example in story in Genesis where there's this much over the top gift giving and generosity, right? Usually it's like a meal prepared for them, a fancy meal, or, kill one of your best animals or something like that, right? In this case, it's going back 2 chapters. Jacob has sent out in advance livestock and sheep and all sorts of things, just send out and servants. Let's be real, slaves. They had slaves.
I say,
and
I don't know.
Sure.
If
Yeah, I can hear you.
I thought I'm still a little new at this. Yeah, it's in my studies, it's come to my attention that 7 metaphysically is more of a physical completion as opposed to a spiritual, which is 12. And it's used a lot of times in that way. 12 disciples.
Well, 12's another one. 12's another one of those numbers, and so is 40.
Mhm.
Yes.
Rain 40 days and 40 nights. Jesus goes in the wilderness for 40 days. These numbers, they mean similar things: completeness, wholeness. 12 because of the 12 tribes of Israel. And then in Revelation, you get plays off of 12 times 12, which is 144, which then changed to bigger, 144,000, which means like super mega complete, bringing a totality. And in this story, it is meant to signify just how ostentatious and extravagant Jacob's apology is, calling him Lord 5 times, bowing 7 times, sending group upon group of animals forward. It's just like, this is, it takes on different meaning if Jacob's doing it out of fear, which may have been his initial motive before his encounter with God in the wrestling match. But afterwards, it seems to be an act of genuine, call it maybe gratitude, or an inward need for restitution. And that's why he names it as blessing. He uses the same word that was used to describe what he had taken from his brother, his father's blessing. So, but yeah, you're right to point out the number 7 being used here on purpose for that, just to really communicate how complete and large Jacob's presence were.
More in the way of a general physical way than a more spiritual way. As 12.
I had not heard that. I'll have to look more into that.
It's interesting.
I have heard,
I'm sorry.
go ahead.
We evolve a lot of different ways, physically and mentally, which are basically, that's kind of a skip up, and then spiritually.
I had heard that the combination of the 3 numbers, 3 is for God, the Trinity, and 4 is for man. And so you put the 2 together and you have the complete story,
The 7.
which is 7.
Mm-hmm.
Now, whether that's right or not, I don't know. That's just what I've been told over the years.
I had heard that before too, growing up. I don't know where that comes from, or where, because oftentimes these ideas come from the writings of rabbinical schools through the centuries as they would develop commentary on the scriptures. And so maybe there's something like that in one of those writings, or I don't know where that came from, but I heard that too before.
I understand how the 3's, God, the Trinity, and all that. I've never been able to understand how 4 represents man. That's what I don't understand, and I think that's the puzzle. I understand God and man making a complete relationship, a covenant, But I'm not sure how man got to be 4. So
You guys have given me things to look at. I just said you guys. I was once corrected by a dear matriarch of the last church when I was in a similar setting, and it was a group of women, and we say, hey guys, come on. It's a kind of a catch-all for the people present, but she was quite upset that I called the room of ladies guys, and so I apologize if I offended anyone.
I think when we think about the fact that Jacob left and was gone for 20 years, and Esau was the child, that he more or less took over and took care of the flocks and did everything that Jacob would have done had he been there. And so therefore that caused him to be blessed because he had taken over and Jacob was absent. I think that's why he had so much.
It's almost so obvious when you put it that way, but I'm sure that's true.
Yeah. I'm curious what happened to the Edomites ultimately. Did they just merge back in with Israel, or did they die out?
This is my slightly more than a guess. I bet you this is what happened. You remember the various empires that would take over Israel. This was happening all over the region. So they were probably subsumed into the Assyrian empires, Babylonian empire, Persian empires. Occasionally Egypt would make a campaign and a push. The reason why Egypt never took over was Egypt they attacked in the spring and they didn't colonize. They plundered, they left. So that's why Egypt multiple times laid waste to different towns and cities and tribal regions all through Mesopotamia and Israel, Palestine area. But they always went home. They went out. The king was expected to leave in the spring and then come back with the plunder. And then, but then when the large empires, one after another, just kept rolling over the area, my guess is that the Edomites would have probably been part of that diaspora. The difference being they didn't have the culture and the religious impetus to remain to maintain an identity. Or maybe, I don't know, but that would be my guess.
I think at one time, though, when Israel was a nation, that they were an enemy of Israel.
Yeah.
Am I wrong on that?
No, you're not. And that's why they were sometimes an enemy. They weren't like the Philistines. When they're mentioned, they're like always the enemy. But they were sometimes enemies.
So Jacob strikes me as such a funny guy. I mean, so much more human even than Abraham and Isaac in many ways. And we're reading so much more about him, I think. And we're getting more stories about him than his predecessors. And I just am wondering in Judaism how he's regarded, if he's regarded as a very great man, or if he's a great man but flawed, or I mean, we've talked about this before, how God chooses who God chooses. It doesn't matter, how he uses imperfect people, which is a really good thing because we're all so imperfect. So we all have the possibility of seeing the face of God in a wrestling match, so that's a good thing.
Yeah.
So, but I just wondered, if there's, we don't name our sons after Jacob because he did such terrible things to his brother Esau, or no, that doesn't matter. I mean, there's a greatness to it. You know what I mean? I just wondered if there was any.
Jacob would continue to be a household name. It's still a name used all the time now, not like just in Jewish homes, Gentile homes.
Sure. Yeah.
And he's going forward, the Israelites would think of themselves as the children of Abraham. They serve as those who serve the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. All three of those patriarchs caught up in the same story. And even though Isaac doesn't get very much airtime, he's like Abraham, quick segue, then Jacob.
Yeah.
So he does it. He just gets a few stories, and they're not even very flattering ones. He gets almost killed on a mountain, then tricked by his sons. I mean, that's kind of his. And then he does have a nice story by the well where he gets his wife Rebecca, which I really like that story. He spends some time with Laban, but no, he is held as a, so we project back moral judgment on the behaviors of Jacob when he's being real tricky and shifty, and I think we should. Sometimes though, tricky, shifty behaviors are admirable. It shows an ability to maneuver and to make the landscape around you easier to walk upon, as it were. And so I think that while we rightfully point out that, if I tricked my father the way that Jacob tricked his father, it would be a bad thing to do, especially if it was to get material wealth away from my other brother.
Right.
But this doesn't necessarily mean that everybody reading the story wouldn't have seen some sort of, maybe been taking notes, thinking that was when you can do it, why not?
Sorry about that. Yeah.
I mean, you get it with Samson. I have Samson in my mind right now. Samson, when we get to Samson, he does all kinds of really questionable things. And he was viewed as a mighty warrior hero, like almost like in the mode of a Herculean god, like a strong man that beat people, tore lions in half, or beat people with donkey's jaw, took down a whole village because he didn't get the wife he wanted. It's like the whole, and this wasn't read. What's that?
He tricked people.
Yeah, he tricked people.
That's the bottom line.
And he was not viewed by the Jewish people as a bad guy. He was seen as a hero because they were by that time in exile when they were hearing those stories. And here was a guy that was able to take care of the enemies.
Yeah.
It has the tragic end to it, of course, where it pushes the building down on himself. But it was a kind of a work of insurrection.
Don't you think he's honored because he took out all the Philistines at the end?
Yeah,
and that's the reason they think so highly of him, because he turned his life around and went back to God and asked for the strength to wipe him out.
He's a tragic hero. And then those sort of stories are told in, across cultures even. And those who were hearing that story would have been under the thumb of a different imperial power and would be thinking like, where's our new Samson? And they were always looking for who that person would be. And every now and again, an insurrection would get off the ground. The books of 1st and 2nd Maccabees are about one of the more successful pushes for their liberation. Actually, they initially were able to thwart the Greeks at that time. And that's thought to have actually happened. As a matter of fact, well, I won't get into it now, but when we went to Israel, we stood on top of an old fortress, a Herodian fortress built by Herod the Great, called Masada. You may have heard of it. And it's a place where a few hundred Jewish rebels took it over and held it down for, I want to say, more than a year. And it had its own water supply, like these cisterns where they had water supply, and it's built out of a mountain. So like you couldn't really get you couldn't get it was inaccessible. You could hold down the fort with a few hundred people. So there were the soldiers and their families. It was like they lived like a village. And it was finally defeated by the Romans, because the Romans built a new hill. Like they basically built a ramp by which they could get up their siege weapons onto up to the top of the fortress. And on the night before the siege ramp would have gone into action, and they would have the Romans would have stormed the fortress, they all committed suicide. My point of bringing up the story is a Samson kind of story in that context is a good story. That's gonna get traction. if you're in that if you're living those times, and that's where Israel often was. Well, if all hearts are clear, I'm going to go ahead and end this time together. Thank you for your comments and your questions, and I'll look into that number theory that you brought up, BK, about 7 and 12. And also, yeah, well, that's for sure. And then also that what you said, I had heard that before, Sue, 3 and 4, but why 4? Maybe because we have 4 arms, and 2 arms and 2 legs. I don't know.
4 is a pretty solid box. It doesn't move much.
4 is an
triangle.
important number across cultures, because of the 4 directions, the 4 corners of the earth as they thought of them.
North, south, east, and west.
Yeah.
4 seasons.
4 seasons. It would have been true there too as well. Yeah. Well, anyway, God bless you, everyone.
So we're on 34 next week? 34 next week?
Yeah.
Yeah. I'm writing it down because I get confused.
Yeah, 34. Take care, everyone.
Me too.
Bye.
Bye, everybody.